A warm hello,
अविनाश सुरु गरौँ।
a warm hello and namaste everyone. Welcome to the seventh episode of Public Dialogue series organized by Kathmandu University School of Management. I am Avinash Jha, MPPM Scholar at Kathmandu University School of Management.
I'm Ujjwal Adhikari, MPPM Scholar at Kathmandu University School of Management. I am also co-hosting this session.
Kusum has
Kusum has established its brand as the pioneer of public policy program in Nepal. It has been running the Masters of Public Policy and Management program since August 2019. The program aims to deal with a wide range of public policy and governance issues, along with enhancing management knowledge and skills of public sector for effective service delivery. The graduates are anticipated to be equipped with tools and models of understand the complexities of the policy process to design, formulate, and evaluate policy alternatives using evidence to address issues, public policy, and social concerns.
the
The
MPPM,
MPPM
the MPPM Scholars Network is a student-led public policy discussion platform within Kathmandu University School of Management that has been organizing regular public policy discourse through its initiative called Tomorrow's Policy Leaders for Public Dialogue. The dialogue series aims to bring together public policy leaders and experts around the world and focus on emerging issues that are important for Nepal's prosperity. We'd like to thank our consortium partners, Fulbright Alumni Association in Nepal, IM Swedish Development Partner, and Nepal Policy Research Network for supporting us organize public dialogue series.
Our theme for today's public dialogue series is Sustainable Development Goals for Inclusive Policy Process and Development Cooperation in Nepal. To talk about this theme, the first panelist for our today's session is Dr. Richard Howard. Currently, Dr. Howard is Resident Coordinator at Interim in United Nations in Nepal. Dr. Howard was appointed as Director at the ILO Country Office for Nepal, based in Kathmandu from August 2016. He has 20 years of management and research experience in Asia and the Pacific, in the private sector, non-governmental organization, and the ILO. His expertise includes gender equality and non-discrimination, migration, indigenous people, sexual and reproductive health, and HIV and AIDS. He has also worked in the ILO as a senior regional specialist on HIV and decent work of marginalized group in Bangkok, Thailand, from 2010 to 2016. The chief technical advisor, private school partnership on health for internal migrants in Beijing, China, from 2006 to 2010. FHI 360 as Asia Regional Program Manager, Private Sector Partnership for Health in Jakarta, Indonesia from 2002 to 2006, and Castle Asia as Director of Research, Industry Analysis and Marketing Strategies in Jakarta, Indonesia, 1996 to 2002. He was a Fulbright scholar in Indonesia with research focusing on gender ethnicity and national identity between 1993 to 1995. Dr. Howard holds a doctorate of philosophy in anthropology from the University of Illinois and Bachelor of Art degree from University of South Carolina.
Our second panelist for today's session is Dr. Hiramani Gimire. Dr. Gimire is currently working with Economic Policy Incubator as Deputy Team Leader. Prior to joining Economic Policy Incubator, he was Executive Director of South Asia Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment. Dr. Gimire has long been involved in development. He was a senior governance specialist with the World Bank for 5 years. He also had worked for UK Department for International Development, DFID, in Nepal. With long experience in Nepal's civil service, he has undertaken several studies in the field of governance, globalization, international trade, and development management. He is a frequent contributor to professional journals and newspapers. Dr. Gimre holds a PhD in public administration from German University of Administrative Science, Speyer. Unfortunately, our third speaker couldn't join the session today because of some last hour urgency. So we are really sorry for that. So now, before we hear from our amazing speakers today, I would like to request our respected Dean Sir, Professor Dr. Vijay Kesi, to share his valuable remarks. Dean Sir, please.
Thank you, Avinash and Ujjwal, and also Puraji for organizing this very interesting dialogue. In Kathmandu University School of Management, we have been organizing this type of dialogues about the among the policy leaders quite often. Now, as Pudaji has already indicated that this is the seventh series. So we have been discussing these things with faculty and also from the experts from different areas. Okay, first of all, let me welcome Dr. Richard Howard, ILO from UN, Nepal. Okay, welcome. Thank you for sparing your time and to be with us. And similarly, Dr. Hiramani Bhimireji. Okay, he is with. He is the now resident coordinator of economic incubator, I think, right? Okay, so welcome you. Thank you very much for sparing your time. And okay, unfortunately, I just came to know that the third speaker is not here, but maybe okay, he may be joining. But anyway, okay. Anyway, welcome to all of you. Thank you very much. Now, in fact, we started this public policy management, public policy and management last year. We initiated this program, and in fact, we had been working on this for almost 2 years, and we did we did quite extensive research, look at the curriculum of different universities, and came out with this program with the support of all experts and the faculty members. So, main objective of this MPPM program is quite often we have been feeling that Kathmandu University School of Management has been producing MBA graduates, so they are working quite fine with the private sector. But somewhere we also realize that unless and until the government sector also works efficiently, perhaps okay now simply focusing on the private sector may not help us to achieve the desired objective, because the role of government will be always there, and then the government should also okay now, work effectively, efficiently, and contribute to the development of the country. Now we know that when you talk about government, it is a big monolith, and what we are feeling is that it is not easy to bring changes there. Okay, so but anyway, we have taken some steps now, and what we feel is that gradually, with our public policy graduates who are also good in management, they will be showing the result in our government as well as in the public institutions. So that with that effort, we have introduced these courses, and while designing this course, we also focus on the management part. Just producing a gamut of policy researchers, always analyzing, then who are there to implement those things, to execute those things? Okay. Now, quite often, what I see here is our problem is the execution of those policies is not happening in the right way.
डाक्टर साहबको स्वर अड्के जस्तो छ अविनाश जी
उहाँकोमा कनेक्टिभिटीकै प्रब्लम छ जस्तो लागिरहेको
छ अविनाश जी तपाईं सुन्नु भएको छ हामीलाई सरको आवाज आइरहेको छैन
हैन सरको आवाज आएको छैन म एकचोटि उहाँलाई कन्फर्म गर्छु
Sorry everyone for the inconvenience due to this technical difficulty in this time of virtual world. Let's wait for our dancer and then we'll continue.
डाक्टर साहबलाई अनम्युट गरौँ भन्नु पर्यो, म्युट छ। डाक्टर साहब अनम्युट गराउँ।
Yeah, now I think you can hear. Okay, I don't know what happened. It got disconnected all of a sudden. Okay, now. Anyway, sorry for the disturbance. The only thing that I was just trying to point out was uh, not only policy analysts, but we also need people who can execute, implement the things. And that is what we see a big gap here. So simply producing results and simply producing the reports one after another is not enough. We need people who can actually execute and manage those things. So that is a big challenge for us. So in this MPPM program, we have also focused on the management part. So there are many courses which help our students to be able to manage in these public institutions as well. So that is also we have focused on that. So apparently, okay, now SDG, there are so many things mentioned in the SDG, but again, what I feel is that until we have good policy and until we have a group of people who can really execute this, whatever we mention in the SDG, we won't be able to achieve those things. So, because we are in the School of Management, we also focus on the management, we also focus on the delivering the result. Simply talking and coming up to policy is not enough. So, from that point of view, we have been focusing on the delivering the things. So, with this, thank you very much, all of you. And I think everyone is just curious to listen to Dr. Richard Howard and also to Hiramaniji. So let me not take a long time. So I thank all the participants who are here. So with this, I pass on this to Avinashi, and then may I just make one request? In 5 or 10 minutes time, I have to leave. Please excuse me for that because there is another PhD Baiba going on in the School of Management. So I'll be joining there. So thank you very much. Thank you, please.
Thank you, Dean sir, for your valuable remarks, and thank you for joining us. So in 2015, the United Nations member states adopted an ambitious and transformative vision for achieving sustainable development in its three dimensions: economic, social, and environmental. Anchored in the principle of universality and human rights with an overarching imperative to leave no one behind, the 2020 Agenda for Sustainable Development seeks to bring about a transition to an era of sustainable development centered on people and the planet. This requires integrated strategies that ensure economic growth and which address economic, social, and environmental needs, including sustainable enterprise development, skill development, health, social protection, decent job opportunities, climate change, environmental protection, and the development of sound institutions. Given this scenario, we came up with today's topic: sustainable development goals for inclusive policy process and development cooperation in Nepal. So in today's session, we'll try to we'll try to seek answers to some of the policy questions. So without any further delay, I would like to request our first panelist, Dr. Richard Howard, uh, and he will be speaking on inclusive economy as a foundation to achieve 2030 agenda for sustainable development goals. So, Dr. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure joining you today. No, in normal times, I think we would all see each other and I would know your students' faces and how they're reacting to what I say, how you're reacting, whether you're bored or not. And really, it would be better to have a dialogue where I could ask people questions to find out what they think. You know, I find with most of these discussions, the students, they know more than we do. They certainly have brighter, more ambitious ideas. And it's good to have that kind of exchange, but maybe we can do that in the question answer. Let's look at some of the words here that we're talking about today. The topic, inclusive economy as the foundation to achieve the SDGs, inclusive economy, and the sustainable development goals. So if we look at this concept of inclusive economy, what is that? You know, I'm amazed at how many times we use these words, inclusive or sustainable, and we don't really think what they mean. I'm not sure I could even give you the right definition, and I work in development. And currently I'm the resident coordinator for the whole UN system. But these are terms that many of our people throw around. They don't really know them. They don't really feel them either. And I think as an anthropologist, we have to question these terms and define these terms as we go forward with our work. And we can all have our own definitions to a degree, because it shapes how we work. So the term inclusive economy, what is that? So inclusive, it means we include others, I believe, in the decision-making in all things about economic growth. And I know best from the perspective of the ILO. Do you know the ILO, International Labor Organization? I've worked here for 15 years, and you know, the fundamental tenet of the ILO is that we achieve social justice by including three parties in a dialogue over the future of all things related to employment and economic growth. So those three parties are the government, trade unions, and private sector organizations, employers organizations. So the way the ILO is structured globally, there's a governing body, and each member state has these three parties present on that governing body, and they vote about issues related to labor standards and how the organization functions. So the labor standards guide the ILO, just like international human rights standards guide the work of the UN. Now those labor standards have been developed over the past 100 years. So they go back a long way. They govern all aspects of work. So they tell us how many hours workers should work a week, whether they should have days off, what are the procedures for determining wages, how we define child labor, how we define trafficking, the steps we take to ensure that migration is safe and fair, all aspects of work, occupational health and safety. So these are the broad issues. Now, in practice, we have labor standards that are endorsed globally, but then it comes down to the country level, and there again, you have the same sort of dialogue structure. And there you have these three parties that decide, you know, which labor standards are ratified, and then how we shape the policies at country level, the labor law, Social Security Act, trafficking laws, Migration, Foreign Employment Act, laws on child labor, minimum wage mechanisms, safety and health policy. These are all things that Nepal actually has endorsed in the last couple of years. 2017, we have really one of the strongest labor acts in Asia Pacific, and a new Social Security law, as well as a child labor action plan, and new procedures for minimum wage, new mechanisms for dialogue in the federal structure. So lots of good policies. And just like it was mentioned just now, that you know, it's not just about policies, but it's also implementing these policies. Now, as you know, our record in implementing some of these key policies on growth has been very poor. And you know, the challenge is always the implementation. But getting back to the inclusive side, so the notion of this ILO structure and how we work is that you have to achieve this right balance between private sector concerns and workers' concerns. So you have to get that balance right. You have to be inclusive to hear the workers' perspective, but you also have to understand equally the importance of the private sector view. That you can't implement a strategy for growth effectively without having a regulatory framework that allows businesses to grow and make money. Now, many people would assume ILO is only working on this worker rights side, but that's not true. It's about getting that balance right between the workers and the employers. Now, the government role is to create the right kind of policies that allows that balance to flourish. But really, it is the workers and the employers who should decide the contents of the policies. Government should regulate, monitor, and enforce where needed. That's the theoretical structure. Now, in some ways, in Nepal, you have this kind of inclusive dialogue that's better than other countries. So if you went to Bangladesh, you'd see, you know, this huge garment sector in the country, And those employers are extremely powerful. They can decide almost everything. The workers don't have a lot of say. And in fact, somehow the workers are under the influence for various reasons of the private sector, of the garment manufacturers. So that's how, somehow you can end up with some horrendous situations like Rana Plaza, where, the standards are not really implemented and workers are put at risk. And the government, even sometimes, because of the importance of particular industries, is not able to entirely control that growth. So I would say that's probably less inclusive. And you go to India, again, I'm characterizing, you can criticize me later, but my impression of India is that you have a very powerful government and the workers' organizations are not that strong. Employers are a bit stronger. So, I get complaints, and internal complaints. I'm just sharing secretly with you that India office is too much in service of the government. You could say that about us here too, but that's another story. So getting that balance right is really not easy. But I think when the balance is not right, you can clearly say that the growth will not be inclusive. Now, what happened to Nepal in 1991 when you had a fairly significant garment industry in parts of the country, like Biratnagar? You had some big manufacturing companies that were doing well, but what happened? The labor relations was at the all-time low. And you saw that the relations were horrific, workers were not happy. Also, you had, bandas for various reasons. And in the end, that growth collapsed. And now you see manufacturing is such a tiny fraction of GDP contribution in the country. And it really does go back to that failure to get the balance right. And that's where we are now. The balance has improved, clearly, but the industry, the manufacturing industry sector, hasn't really bounced back for a number of reasons, but it still could. So then over the past 10 years, we saw these partners come together at federal level and national level back then and say, okay, we got to get this balance right. We're going to do a new Labor Act, a new Social Security Act. And they did, and they drafted very carefully. And they endorsed these laws in 2017, I believe. And implementation has been very slow. So, you got that right, but some things went wrong. So one thing that went wrong is when we had these consultations on the law, we did not anticipate the importance of local, municipal level. What's municipal level now? Employers. Those businesses have very different needs than the big businesses here in Kathmandu. So now you have a social security law, and you have, what is the contribution? Total contribution, 31%. And you ask the local business owner in Biratnagar again, what do you think of this? It's like it's so out of alignment with the way they would have designed it. Same thing on labor law, same thing on wage policy. So particularly now the federal level and the needs at local level, even provincial level. So I think we went wrong with that. And of course, the implementation has also been just a huge challenge because the laws have really not been implemented in line with that spirit of inclusion. So there's still time to fix that, but it's still a challenge. So that's my understanding of what inclusive economy is from really the ILO perspective. Now, of course, there's inclusion that doesn't involve trade unions in the country. So just to tell you a story, let's talk about the issue of indigenous peoples and how they participate in the development process. Can you carry out development without adequate consultation with indigenous groups? Now, when I came into the ILO, I was trying to push these laws through, and we were trying to endorse new labor standards. I'd like to see the country ratify Convention 87 on freedom of association. It still is not done. It's something every other country has done. So I've been pushing for these kind of things with government, and along comes a case on 169, Convention 169 on indigenous peoples. My first reaction was, this is really a barrier for us to achieving a lot of things, but I didn't look into it closely enough. So, In the recent years, I've looked closely into the issues of indigenous people. So I would say, in June, I visited, let's talk about Kokana and Bungamati and the fast track highway, the cyber city, the dry port, all these things that are being built by the government with some involvement of international donors. Now, from a development perspective, these all look really good. Like, how can we have development without a big highway across the country? Very difficult. But when I went to visit the sites, I spoke to really scores, dozens and dozens of farmers who were losing their land and didn't know what to do next. And I visited several sites where they're being pushed off their land and they don't want to go. There were demonstrations. And so they're losing their only source of livelihood and they don't know what to do next. Now, even they say the development is good. We want this development to go forward. But at the same time, they have no idea what they're going to do next. And the small amount of money that the government offered them isn't going to do them very good for very long. You give somebody, a farmer, a chunk of money with no skills of how to use that money, to develop a business or whatever, then basically, you give them something that's not going to last. So that's not sustainable for them. So I see that across the board, and that's the land side of this. And then of course there's the whole cultural angle that people's traditions and the temples in that area, some of them will be destroyed, and the government doesn't yet recognize those as cultural sites that should be preserved, even though they're very, very significant culturally, and that's recognized by UNESCO. So this is a classic case where you have issues of inclusion, but it doesn't really relate to the ILO tripartite structure directly. Now, when I went to see the Mofaga minister on this issue, it's a very different perspective. That he said that people, most of them were okay with his project, or the cultural sites were not significant, that the development was important. So that development from his perspective will go ahead, and the farmers will just make do. So that's a different perspective about what's inclusive and what's not inclusive. So that, I think that's an important issue, because the indigenous issue is always a question. It always challenges us about whether our approaches are inclusive or not. So what happens when development is not inclusive? I think you have increasingly large numbers of people who are not happy with the government, feel disenfranchised, they don't benefit from growth. And ultimately, if those numbers are big enough, it will lead to social instability. So that's the notion that whether your growth is sustainable or not. I mean, if you look at Thailand, you have a lot of growth, but you also have severe divides between the elite and the working class, which really falls so tightly along political parties, and that issue is just never resolved. And partly that's a failure in the inclusive approach on economic development. Certainly Nepal is vulnerable to that. So addressing this trade unions is one aspect, but the indigenous peoples are definitely another aspect. So now comes COVID. I'd like to talk a little bit about COVID, because for me, COVID has challenged everything that we do in development in Nepal. And I would say my personal reflection is that everything that we failed on in the past or haven't been successful yet, working with the government and our partners, becomes so acutely visible as a failure, as a crack in our development process, as a fault line in the foundation of the society. And I think many of the gaps are so apparent now. So just to talk about the employment issue. So, the employment structure in the country. We know that 81% of workers are in informal economy. So they don't benefit from social protection generally. Now we have two tiers of social protection in the country, sort of the cash, non-conditional cash transfers that reach certain vulnerable groups, and those have been very effective. But the coverage, of course, is still low, but it's not bad compared to other South Asian countries. Now, you would also have, in many countries, the contribution-based social security for workers, Normally that covers formal economies workers first, and then it expands to the informal economy. So what we saw, what did we see? What did you see with the collapse? So when we saw the lockdowns that began in March, and really the shutdown of the tourist industry, we saw the government introduce a number of measures for small and medium enterprises and food support for people in informal economy at the ward level, a number of initiatives, but there was never really any large or immediate consultation with the private sector or with the workers' organizations. It happened about 2 months after the relief packages were introduced. So even for formal economy workers that receive decent wages generally, there was no kind of tripartite agreement in the early days about how to address the wage payments. Now that did come, it was a little bit late, so that was a good thing. But again, that's a tiny fraction of the whole workforce, about 1 million workers. So the rest of the people working in informal economy, daily wage workers, really didn't have anything. They went from eating hand to mouth to not having anything. And the government refused to expand cash transfer subsidies for those people, and instead, it issued sort of food distribution in some areas, which is, from a COVID point of view, is not particularly safe, or from an economic point of view, it's not particularly cost efficient. It's easier, it's cheaper to give people small grants in times of crisis rather than try to manage food distribution with better results. Globally, that's proven. So again, lack of consultation about what people need on the ground. And there was an assumption, I think, for example, from some party leaders that I met, that people shouldn't be given cash. This is a political viewpoint. Some people say, okay, cash payments in times of crisis, people use them well. They don't develop a sense of dependency on the government. They tend to get back on their feet. From a political perspective, in many countries, including my own, the US, this notion of giving people cash is looked down upon. So the result was, people didn't get the kind of cash support they needed. So even in a time of crisis, what we see is that there really wasn't an adequate social protection framework or social security framework, more specifically for workers. And the most vulnerable workers, informal economy, daily wage workers, their needs were entirely or practically unmet. So the most vulnerable segment in the community was not sufficiently addressed in times of crisis. So what it says is our system before the crisis was not in place, but even with the crisis, it became more apparent. So I think that's one area where we need to focus. And people say build back better all the time. That means we need to build a social security system that works for all workers. We need unemployment insurance, and we need systems to help daily wage workers when there's shocks like this, to help them. And it has to be designed based on their needs. So that, to me, that's one of the big lessons learned about the importance of inclusive approaches, not only in crisis, but in regular times. The crisis just highlights those weaknesses through what I would say is a magnifying glass. It's so much more visible. Now, the second area I would highlight is the whole migration challenge for Nepal. So, these challenges more than me. So before the crisis, we had 2018, we had one of the Office of Human Rights, the High Commission on Human Rights came. They sent a special rapporteur on migration rights, and they looked at the situation in Nepal, and he made several recommendations. And I think those recommendations were very much in line where we also thought the government should make improvements. So one was this notion of the Foreign Employment Act. This Foreign Employment Act of 2007 was supposed to be revised in line with the Constitution and the federal system, decentralizing services to local levels. Services on the ground where people are always better than when they're many, many miles, kilometers away, hours of travel. So we needed those services for recruitment, which would be monitored by local government. We needed services for dispute resolution, even for health checkups. All these things work better when they're closer to people. Of course, the government refused to do that and really maintains the centralized services at federal level, but they did do some very minor kind of labor permit distribution in district labor offices, utilizing the old structure even. So that was not a big check mark for them in terms of improvement. So another issue on migration is this whole issue of undocumented migrant workers. You know, we in the ILO, we say undocumented, we don't say illegal. Now, some people, when they don't have access to traveling or migrating through formal channels, and here there's a formal process, as you know, with labor permits and support from consulates somewhat in receiving countries. So many workers find that's not the way they can go for whatever reason. One is often high cost, you know, the recruitment agencies and others. There's a whole system, I say a corrupt system of recruitment in the country where labor recruiters bring migrants on board, they charge very high fees. Those fees are shared with a number of parties across the system. So it's a system of corruption that is not just borne by recruitment agencies, but is shared across the board, reaches into all levels of society. So who loses in that system of recruitment? Of course, the migrant workers. So the challenges when the crisis hit is that so many workers have migrated through undocumented channels. Now, especially women. So what we've seen with women is that, you know, a number of age bans or limitations on female migration were put in place with good motivation to protect them, but in some ways they have also encouraged them to migrate through undocumented channels, and that's put them at more risk. Now, a third area of weakness really was the lack of services for migrant workers in the destination countries. We see the consulates, they're set up, they have labor attachés who are responsible for migration, but those are not very functional. And we know that the labor attachés that have been recruited are generally not well trained, and they don't work well within the consulate structure. So the big challenge there. So what happened is when the crisis hit, and migrants all over the world lost their jobs and needed to come home, who got hit the hardest? It was the women, the informal workers, the domestic workers in Kuwait that didn't have a legal permit. So many of them were jobless, stuck, stranded, and they needed to get back. Even the governments of Kuwait were willing to send them back, but they still waited for several months to get back. So we saw the weaknesses in our labor migration governance framework. The consulates weren't necessarily effective in delivering services, even registering them. Sometimes there was even corruption at that level that made it harder for those people. So what little money they had, they lost it in the process of trying to come home. Then they come back and they go to the holding centers, and many of these poorest, the poor women, the undocumented workers, could not even get back to their villages because they didn't have any money. And again, same thing with the wage workers. The government hadn't set aside, didn't want to give them cash because they thought that might somehow reduce their motivation to work. Meanwhile, they were stuck. Now, of course, many women migrated because they faced gender-based violence or stigma in their communities. They didn't want to go home. So you had a lot of women stuck here in Kathmandu. They didn't want to go home. They didn't know where to go. So a lot of good NGOs stepped in to help there. So to me, the COVID crisis not only showed our weaknesses in addressing informal economy workers, but also very much on the migrant workers. To me, that's a big lesson learned of things that we need to do better. Now, on the positive side, I think the government has very much realized some of these weaknesses, and they're starting to make changes to address them. So, for example, the Labor Committee in Parliament recognized that age bans were hurting, and they've recommended lifting those in some countries based on certain criteria or requirements. So that's a very positive step. Also, you know, I think they've modified their support for migrant reintegration over time. So the third area I say really is the whole issues of employment at a local level, so job creation. So I don't know if you've been tracking this story, but when we had a new government come in, And we had Gokarna Bista, the very dynamic Minister of Labor, 500,000 jobs. We're going to create 500,000 jobs this year, first year of the government, right? And because, why did we get that number 500,000? Because we had 500,000 young people leaving the country. So fine, we'll just create 500,000 jobs, just that easy. But you know, governments generally, in my 20 years working in Asia, governments are not so good at creating jobs. They can do some short-term measures, you know, labor-intensive projects and things like that. But, you know, private sector creates jobs, not governments. So, you know, there really hasn't been the kind of consultation with private sector and even SMEs, small and medium enterprises, to ask them, what are your barriers to job creation and how can we help you eliminate those barriers? So there's a lot of talk about job creation, both for the relief stage and this immediate recovery, and the government has a 3R plan to help, you know, relief, recovery, resilience. But in the relief stage, you know, it's more the labor-intensive approaches. But the big challenge is how do they create sustainable jobs for the future? And I think there are a number of solutions, but the barriers have been well identified. You know, the World Bank has done many studies doing business in Nepal, and they know their issues. Compared to other countries, they rank poorly, but not the worst. And ILO's done studies on SMEs and their policy challenges. Many of the gaps and the constraints are well understood. I don't think we need to study them anymore because we all know them. But the issue is, like, why are they not being addressed? So one issue of job creation really has to do with, I believe, has to do with foreign investment. Because in any country, look around in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, they've had the growth based with foreign investment. Now, they were part of the older growth story of really heavy manufacturing driven growth at the early stages that diversified over time. Thailand's much more diversified. Indonesia has diversified, but foreign investment was so critical, even in the tourism sector. So, you know, the idea is that you have an open, dynamic market and you know, as much as possible. Now, and foreign investment policy has made it difficult, really, for foreign investors here. I think one of the biggest challenges is even just obtaining visas for their managers to come in to initially start the business. There's an assumption, I think, that if we give too many, we let these foreigners stay too long, they're going to take all of our jobs away. But generally, you know, the big corporations of the world, you know, they don't want to keep their people in country one day longer than they have to. So generally you see a team's coming in, they work 2 or 3 years and then they're out. They nationalize all the positions because that saves them money. But the government doesn't really allow them to stay very long. You know, generally it's just such a struggle. So many investors have said, you know, it's just not worth it to come here. And that was a key barrier that they point out. But there are a range of other issues. I think another challenge is the hold of the big corporations on the government policymaking and investment approval processes, that it makes it hard. So, you know, while we do have some big industries that do create jobs, it's not in their interest to allow competitors to come into the market. So they have a tendency to heavily influence government officials to make decisions that are in the favor of the big domestic industries. So the losers in that equation are the workers who would benefit from a more dynamic economy with newer jobs. So that's sort of the big business foreign investment, the overall challenges. I think the minimum capital threshold, I'm not sure if it's been removed, but that was a barrier. The former finance minister had committed to removing that, but that's a barrier, particularly for the medium-sized investment in the country. You see a lot of small businesses have already left the country. You know, Thailand is driven by a lot of small business investment that you simply can't get here for two reasons: the investment threshold, but also the visas are so difficult. So it's a country that, as a foreigner, you probably wouldn't come here to settle down and start a business. You know, it's just too hard. You know, and it's not like it's the best market in the world anyway. So that's one thing. So then the other issue is really the challenges of the SMEs. And I think there, federalism has been a little hard on a lot of the SMEs from a taxation point, from local policies that are not consistent with provincial and federal policies. I think access to finance is a challenge, particularly for those sort of small or medium size that are starting to grow, but they haven't formalized, they're not registered, and so they're not benefiting from access to finance. I think the government doesn't really quite yet have a formalization strategy for SMEs that would bring them in and register them, get them paying taxes, but also support their growth. So I think there's a tendency to view formalization only as something that's good for government. You just got to get them in and register, they'll do it, it's the right thing to do. But it has to also work for the businesses and address some of those constraints that they have. So there has to be the right balance of incentives and responsibilities on formalization. So I think addressing their needs really from their perspective, and that gets back to the inclusion argument. We do have to understand the needs from small businesses and help them to grow. So those are the three challenges, I think: the social protection, the migration issues, and the employment challenges, both from the foreign investment, but also the SME perspective, that we need to pay more attention to in the future. So overall, I think a lot of these challenges can be achieved through consultation, but consultation is messy and it takes a long time. But at some point, I think the government does have the right to say, okay, we've heard you and we're doing this. We're not going to make everyone happy, but we have to move forward. And I think you also have to have that kind of forceful leadership with inclusive growth, or otherwise you'll get stuck in a process of consultation and no movement. Sometimes the UN is like that. I'm coordinating the UN and there's a lot of consultation, but at some point you have to say, okay, I got it. This is what we're going to do. And I recognize that governments have to do that. And we're not going to all be happy, but we have to move forward. So that's my closing statement. Thank you for having me speak, and I hope I didn't talk too long. Sometimes I feel I can't talk for 20 minutes, but I think I did today. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Award, for your insightful presentation. I think you briefly covered different areas of sustainable development goals. And as you said, economic growth and inclusiveness must go hand in hand. Achieving sustainable development goals has been usually hampered by trade-off in favor of economic growth, social well-being, and ecological viability, which might ultimately affect the sustainable development goals. And we should always be able to find the right balance between social inclusion and economic growth, keeping environmental factors in mind. And I'm sure our audience today have a lot of queries. So as per our program modality, so now we'll hear from our other panelists, and then after that, we'll go for a question and answer round, and then we'll take our questions from the audience. So without any delay, I would like to request our other panelist, Dr. Hiramani Gimre, for his presentation. Dr. Hiraman, sir.
Thank you, Avinashi. Dr. Purna Nepali, fellow panelist Richard, and members on the enlightened audience here. It's very good to be able to talk to this group on SDGs, inclusive policies, and development cooperation. The three themes selected for us today are very well interlinked, and I think we can tell a good story around them. I would like to start with institutions. Governance is my area, so I would love to talk about institutions and how they function, how they could be reformed, how they could be strengthened, etc. And from that perspective, the SDG goal number 16 is an area of my interest. SDG 16, as you know, is about peaceful and inclusive societies, rule of law and access to justice for all, and more importantly, accountable and inclusive institutions. Then again, Richard was speaking about inclusiveness, inclusive institutions, and so on. So this all is very strongly rooted in this SDG goal 16. And that's very important because they are all, I would like to examine these issues in the context of Nepal, because these are not necessarily part of our international obligations. If you look at the Constitution of Nepal itself, the Constitution is strongly committed to promoting the same issues: inclusive growth, inclusive institutions, accountable institutions, and so on. So there is a very strong relationship between what we aspire as part of a constitution and what is our obligation in terms of international agreement in the SDG. Very important. So this is a very important area. But this goal number 16 is not, it's probably the most important, but it is not most important because of these three issues that it wants to address. It's important, most important for three reasons. First, this is the first time that an international agreement has been signed in relation to governance and state institutions. This has never happened in development cooperation. It was always cooperation between states to build a road, to build a bridge, and to promote health reform and so on. But accountability, rule of law, inclusion, etc., are such issues that each country would like to say that, okay, it is they are all issues very dear to my heart, but I can handle this. So no international interest would be tolerated, basically. And but as part of this SDG agreement, countries have agreed to subject themselves to international scrutiny on some of these issues. So a major achievement, and based on that, we can say that with this agreement, the Westphalian order that was enabled by the Treaty of Westphalia, you might remember, signed in 1648, 400 years ago, which says that, okay, there is this territorial sovereignty and people within their territory can do anything they like. And this is a challenge to this concept that you can't do anything you like in terms of governance, in terms of institutions, because you have to agree to this international agreement. And therefore, you have to also define your results, define your outcomes in terms of institutions and governance. Therefore, if you look at the 15th plan, you will see a results framework at the end of the 15th plan, and there are sophisticated indicators and outcomes, etc., defined for institutions and governance and inclusion, etc. It is a different question whether they are practical, whether the government would be able to achieve them, etc. We can debate that, but the very idea that results in terms of governance are defined as part of the planning process is very important, and this has been enabled, this has been encouraged by this SDG agreement. Second, why this is so important, it's also, excuse me, sir, I'm in a meeting, I'm going to go. Sorry, that was small disruption. Second reason why it is so important is that the SDG also, this agreement is also speaks about more inclusive governance institutions in the international level. So it is not about, Richard, it is not only about inclusion in Nepal, but even the international institutions like the ILO or the World Bank or the IMF should be inclusive. And it's an opportunity for us that a country like Nepal with poor resources, with poor influencing capability, etc. So we should try to use this arrangement in the interest of being represented at the World Forum. So we should be inclusive in World Governance Institution, which is also important for us here. And then this goal is important, as I said, but it's also important in terms of it enables the achievement of other SDG goals. It's the most important because many other SDG goals like inclusion, economic development, and so labor, etc., unless you have strong, accountable governance institutions, then it's very difficult to talk about other goals. So in that sense, it's very important, and also important, and Richard also spoke about this, referred to this, that the importance of politics is extremely important, major important in development. Many scholarly studies, for example, done by Francis Fukuyama, you might be familiar with him, say that unless you have right politics and you have accountable politics, accountable political parties, political institutions, then you can't talk much about real economic growth or economic opportunities or inclusion even. So these are some of the reasons that make this goal very, very, very relevant. And for us in Nepal, one, as I said, the constitution is related to this arrangement, but also the newly introduced federalism, which is about creating a balance between three levels of government. And we are already seeing huge problems in the recent cases. You see that the provincial governments have not been able to exercise their own power. They have been given power. For example, who defines the capital city of a province? It's up with the provincial assemblies. But did we see that? No, because despite the institutional arrangements, the political parties have not yet been open to empowering subnational levels of government. And again, as part of this agreement, we should see that some of these arrangements on strengthening federalism could be implemented more effectively. When I say this is not that we are trying to criticize the government for not being able to be promoting these agendas. The government's own reports. Look at the Auditor General's report this year. Look at the CIIA report of this year. Look at the reports issued by the parliamentary committees, for example. All these reports talk about failure of accountability, non-inclusiveness, extractive institutions, to quote a famous book, Why Nations Fail. And they are raising these issues. So the government itself is aware of what the gap is in terms of building institutions. So we have to work on these. But the question is, when you speak of international cooperation on institution capacity, institution building, etc., this is a very tricky issue. And we should realize that it's a long-term process. Institutions to take time to build. There is one study by the World Bank which says that to build one rule of law institution or one anti-corruption agency, you will need 40 years, 40 years. And they say, if you are really interested in this, if the commitment is real, then you would need 40 years to build an institution. So it's not an easy job. And every politician says that, okay, we will, in the next 5 years, we will do this and that. Simply impossible. And the first task for us is to realize that it will take time. It's difficult. And you need to be working on step by step. You would be trying to reinforce your objectives, you're reinforcing your steps. Only then could you do something. But this is not something to be achieved within a very short span of time. So we should realize that. Now, because the importance of this institution building goal, we should see this goal also as part of other SDG goals. For example, SDG 5 is directly related to this, gender empowerment. SDG 8, economic growth, employment, inclusive employment, etc., is also related to this. So let's see the question of inclusion again to slightly to complement Richard's presentation here. In the inclusion area, SDG 5, gender inclusion especially, we are doing much, and Nepal is being appreciated by many partners. Okay, this has been a good arrangement, and we are making long strides in terms of inclusion. But at the same time, we had a very bad reputation of being seen as one of the most unequal society in Asia. Unequal society in Asia. When I say unequal, I don't necessarily mean unequal in terms of economic indicators, measures. For example, the Gini coefficient, for example. Probably on the Gini coefficient, we are not too bad compared to other Asian countries. But when it comes to the interaction between the people and the state, then this inequality becomes so visible. For example, if you want to access services, the first question for you is who you are. It's not that public services are universally applicable. And in this, Richard also spoke about, in this time of COVID, for example, we are saying that to be able to receive a COVID treatment, you see the difference. There is some pre-agreed, defined, unwritten codes of quotes. So we know that who, if you fall sick, who of you would get what kind of treatment in which hospital with what arrangements. So that shows how critical the issue is. So in terms of the, because of the formal rules sometimes, for example, in terms of gender equality, let's look at the recent report published by the World Economic Forum. They publish this report every year covering some gender gap issues. And they have four measures: political empowerment, health issues, educational opportunities, and so on, economics, and so on. And based on this report, I just give an example to show how the gap is in our country. In terms of the political empowerment of women, Nepal is one of the best countries and is in the 59th position, is only second best in South Asia after Bangladesh, by the way. So after Bangladesh, we are the best country in terms of political power, 59th, which means, Richard, better than your own country, better than the USA. So in terms of political empowerment of women, better than Singapore, for example. So that's good. And the hope was, and the assumption is, if you are politically empowered, you can influence other policies, for example, economic policies, employment policies, education, etc. Politics is at the heart of everything. So the hope was, if you are politically empowered, you can do much for your community. Now look at the difference in Nepal. The women global position is 59, but when you look at the economic index of the same gap defined by the World Economic Forum, economy-wise, women are in the 133rd position. Now look at the whole assumption has been defeated here, because you are in the 59th position politically, very strong, better than USA and Singapore, but in terms of economic opportunity, you are in the 133rd position, which means then the interpretation is political empowerment in Nepal, unlike elsewhere, unlike in other countries. In our case, political empowerment doesn't necessarily create strength, voice, opportunities for women in their engagement in the economy. And that's a very sad situation, because it defies all assumptions, arguments that politics is very important. And why is this so? Because the institution, the WEF put Nepal in the 59th position because of the strong presence of women in parliaments, both at the federal parliament and the provincial parliament, the local parliaments. So that was one of the reasons why the position was good. But in terms of being able to exercise actual power, women are not that far ahead in terms of powers. And there are many informal rules then. Therefore, institution also means formal and informal. There are some informal rules that make the formal rules less effective. So you have to go to the informal rule to see why, despite their position, women have not been able to influence the agenda. And that's very important. We need to look at that also. So overall, in terms of these institutions, the Constitution, as I said, foresees major inclusion as an objective. Inclusion in Nepal is a constitutional objective. And Constitution has created some institutions also. For example, the Inclusion Commission itself, a Constitution Commission on Inclusion, a Constitution Commission on Dalits, one for women, one for Tharu. What do you need now? All these institutions are there for promoting inclusion. But 5 years into the implementation of the Constitution, some of these commissions have not been even formed. Or if formed, there is no leadership. Or if there is leadership, there is no staff. If there is no staff, then there is no budget. So in other words, we should not hesitate to say that the state is deliberately trying to make them dysfunctional. So all these 5 or 6 constitutional commissions have not been able to function. So again, here the formal rules, very good, all pro-inclusion commissions, etc. And if all these are commissions would be able to carry out their mandate, then we should have a different picture in terms of inclusion, but informal rules dominate, and which means the constitutions are not even formed or are not functional. So in that case, what should you do? There are, as the book Why Nations Fail says, extractive institutions. They deliberately prevent inclusion, and therefore any formal rules would not be effective. Then this inclusion, therefore, is related to capacity. You might ask why this 1/3 strength of women in our parliament. That's a big achievement. 1/3 of strength of parliament is huge. So the women, if they got together, they could influence any policy agenda. They could challenge the government. They could challenge the minister, etc. But why they look so um, weak in terms of policy influencing? The reason is the capacity is an issue. So any policy on inclusion must be associated with capacity enhancement. You need capacity to exercise your agency. So the agency, you get some recognition for your agency through representation and law, but you can't exercise it unless you are empowered enough, unless you have the capacity, unless you know the issue, unless you are able to mobilize. So our first agenda then, not to be complaining about laws and rules, that there are enough good laws and rules, etc., but to capacitate those who are not included to exercise the agency that has been recognized by the laws and rules and regulations. So that's our agenda, and in terms of policy making, that should come forward. The other agenda for these groups, for inclusion, etc., to be able to participate in policy making. Participate is a hugely popular word in Nepali governance literature, but this is also misused. I know that you should know that there is a book called Tyranny of Participation. Sometimes if you overuse this word of participation, it becomes tyrannical also. So the participation in a nominal sense, there is much, but in a critical sense, there is not. So there is a scale of participation. Are you promoting participation just in a nominal sense, or in an instrumental sense, or in a transferability sense? There are a number of ways. And in Nepal, we see that nominal participation is taking place, but the real one is not. And you see that in the policy debate, despite the constitutional legal arrangements, the planning steps, etc., they all require participation. But and participation does take place, but it becomes so formal, so ritualistic, then actually you have not been able to influence the policy agenda. Policy is an outcome of contestation between different stakeholders, and this real contestation is not taking place. And one way to promote this contestation would have been to promote civil society participation in general. But in Nepal, but also in this case, like elsewhere in South Asia, the space for civil society is unfortunately shrinking. In India, we see that major NGOs are being treated by the government in a very bad way. Just 2 weeks ago, you might have heard that Amnesty International has closed its business in India. But we in Nepal are not any better. Okay, outright closure of NGOs has not taken place, but overall the support, the government's attitude towards NGO is not good enough. And these issues then make it difficult for promoting goal 8, inclusive economic opportunities, employment, etc., because unless these groups of people find a way to policy making, have capacity enough, etc., then it is really difficult for them to talk about employment, growth, innovation, even investment. It becomes very, very difficult. Finally, on something on development cooperation. And in order to be able to do all this, we need resources, obvious. Nepal is anyway a dependent country. We are dependent on foreign aid. 25% of our budget every year comes from foreign aid. Now, even without SDGs, without COVID, we would need resources. But with the SDGs and your commitment is so huge that we have done a calculation of what level of cost we will require. And the cost for Nepal in terms of implementing these SDGs, the things we are talking about today, Richard and I, we are talking about it, to be able to implement these goals, Nepal would need $1.8 thousand billion. 1800 Arab rupiah. And that is, just to give a sense of how big it is, that is 40 times the GDP of Nepal as of now. So the GDP, we are saying that Nepal is now some 37 billion, times 40 is the requirement for SDG implementation. Can you do this alone? Impossible. Therefore, every year there is this gap in terms of financing SDGs. And the initial assessments are saying that there is an average of 12% of GDP equivalent of gap in terms of financing these activities. So it's impossible for Nepal to do it alone. And this calculation, you know that it was done pre-COVID with the hope that the economy will grow at 6%, at least 6% every year. But now that we have seen, the growth is around 0. And therefore, this gap in terms of investment will even increase in the years to come. So how do we do that? Probably we look to our foreign partners, aid donors, but also there the situation doesn't look so good. For example, you know that back in the 1970s, in 1972 to be precise, there was an international agreement under the Pearson Commission that all rich donors, rich countries would give 0.7% of their gross national income to poor countries. So the 0.7% is a major target, agreed in 1972. But this target has not been met. As of now, only 6 countries have provided this levels of aid. And the OECD countries, rich country, the rich country club, as we call them, the average aid allocation of these countries is 0.3%, which is less than half of the international commitment. So they are not meeting their obligation. And rich countries are not doing their part. The USA, for example, is giving less than 0.2%. So these resources are, there is this problem. And when we talk to the donors, there is a emergingly popular word called aid fatigue. Okay, guys, we are tired of giving aid. So aid fatigue dominates this thinking. So therefore, what should you do? There is one thing, the level of aid is not enough. But on the other hand, the process of foreign aid is also a problem. If you look at the development cooperation report this year, published by the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Finance, the Minister of Finance, Dr. Khandiwala, have also complained about aid fragmentation, for example. Poor specialization among donors themselves. And their aid is over-fragmented, not using the country systems against the principle of Paris Declaration. So there are huge problems in how you deliver aid. It's not only about what amount, but how you deliver your aid is also a major question. And there are tensions between the government and the donors in how to do it, how to strengthen this relationship. On the other side, donors, I have also seen the position of donors on their side. And there are also complaints about the government not being recipiable, the fiduciary risks are always a challenge, and so on. So both sides have strong arguments. So I think it's an opportunity for us to come together and have an open, unreserved dialogue on each other's roles so that we have a better understanding. But even with that, what we need in terms of aid would not be enough only through mobilizing what we call ODA, official development assistance, would not be enough. So we do need to now explore other options. And the International Committee is already doing this. For example, in the ODA, we always have talked about North-South cooperation. The rich countries of the North would help the poor countries of South. Now, in the South also, there are some countries building their economies, they are getting stronger and so on. So we are now talking about what South cooperation facilitated and aided by the North. So the three sides, the two sides of the South and the North, all three sides should work together to promote this triangular cooperation. There are many other instruments for aid, for example, philanthropies, private philanthropies are coming up. And then, speaking of aid, we always have looked at governments. Government should deliver aid. But now there's a private institutions, private philanthropies are coming up. We should also be able to tap into these private resources also. And there is something called blended finance, that you need to blend official aid, government aid, private financing, philanthropy, etc., and work towards the advantage of each of these actors. So there are a number of instruments, innovations in terms of getting blended finance also. So that's something we need to be trying to explore. And finally, on the aid, finally my final point. There is something called Tobin tax, a tax proposed by an economist called Tobin. He's a Nobel laureate. So he had proposed back in the 70s, but now this is becoming more important. And he says that we should raise some resources through an mechanism from the financial market. This is being debated. This is not as acceptable as other instruments of aid, but this is something for us to think about. So with all this, if we are innovative enough to use these opportunities, I think we can generate some resources for financing SDGs. Otherwise, this will remain a challenge for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gimre, for an insightful presentation. Dr. Gimre has started his presentation from the SDG goal number 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institution, and briefly touched about the institutions like CIA, the report of Auditor General report. I think he was trying to refer the report which accounts around 600 billion Nepalese rupees of irregularities. And also he touched about the data of women representation in politics and compared the other worlds among us. And similarly, Dr. Gimre also touched about the internal political and legal constraints for implementing the federalism. And with this, we all are very thankful to him. We entire MPPM scholars are highly indebted for this insightful presentation. And with this, we would like to open the floor for Q&A sessions. And we are already, I think there are a couple of questions in chat box, and we have also, this session is also being live streamed from the Facebook page of MPPM Scholar Network. We will also take the comments question from that platform as well. So I would like to open the questions for and please raise your hands and you can ask the question, or you can simply write your question in the chat box. There is question from Susma Sharma in the chat box. If you are online right now, you can unmute yourself and please ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me for this floor. Actually, I have a question with Mr. Richard. I have raised the question. I'm running a Women Can non-profit organization, but I'm associated with most of this women chamber and most of the women entrepreneurships forum. So what I found current situation is there is something gap with the SMEs, MSMEs, and micro level entrepreneurship. So what sort of SDGs policy is going to review on, current COVID situation that most of the startups and most of the small entrepreneurs and medium entrepreneurs are going to be collapsed, and they have lots of difficulties. As we are mentioning that access to finance and financial inclusion is there, but how can we make next strategy in this area in prospect to Nepal?
Thank you, Susmaji. We'll also take a couple of questions, and the panelists will answer it. There is a question from Chiranjeevi Bhattarji. Can you please unmute yourself and ask?
Namaste, everyone. My question is with Dr. Howard. Would you point out some of the initiatives that ILO Nepal is implementing in this corona context to address the problems?
Thank you. We have another question from Roma Pariyarji. Can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Well, hi and namaskar to you all. So this is not my question. As a general public, I just want to know that the SDGs talk about the gender biasness, gender equality, right? So in this webinar also, I just want to let you know all that. We just talk about many things like gender equality, there should be always. But right now here also, we can see there is less. And the Harish or some sir has said that her capacity, he just talk about the capacity, which I don't believe on it, because until and unless the woman is not given, the freedom and the platform where she can express her intelligence. So right now also we can see that there is less participation in this webinar. And for the sustainable goal development, there is equal participation of the woman and the men. But until and unless the woman is not get freedom from this household chores, I don't think so there will be the sustainable development goal works like fluently. So I just want this is not my question. I just want all of us to notice that we just talk about the woman, equality. But in this simple webinar also, there is so much less participation of the woman. Then how can women take, big decision in the development of the country? So I just want that only to remind you all.
Thank you, Romaji. Very.
Krishna sir has been raising his hand. Please.
Yeah, Krishna sir, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you very much. Well, first I have to welcome to Richard, because he became our UN resident coordinator for Nepal, because he knows Nepal well, working with a very critical area of ILO. At the same time, Hiramani Dai, he is a very much pioneer about the governance and development in Nepal. So both has a very good presentation today. And now my concern is, because this inclusion, and the state institution, mobilization of the institution are still not functioning in a rule. It is functioning ad hocly. I mean, if you have a good approach with the government system, you can do it. If you have a good approach with the donor system, you are good. But nobody is considering the real sense. And sometimes I'm very much confused when we are talking about the policy. The policymaker never thought from his own perspective, as a civil, as a person, he never think whether that policy can address his requirement, his needs, whether it is give his protection, social protection kind of things. Never do that. Because it is obvious, because they are paid, they are consultant. So they always try to please to their client. Maybe that is good, but when we are talking about the policy and the impact in the long run, it is very critical. Like I would say now in the districts, people are talking about the 3 tier of government, and according to the constitution, district also come in the local government. And the district coordination committee has a very different function now. Its function is only for monitoring and coordination. And that is very much critical, and nobody likes to have that kind of oversight body to be strengthened. So they want to make this district level political institution very weak so that their usual business can run easily. Nobody cares about the monitoring, nobody criticizes whether they are doing good or not, and everybody can show themselves. So as a general public, it's very difficult, like Richard was mentioning, when people are, migrant people are returning during this Banda in COVID time, they suffer a lot. When people came into the districts and there is no their government in taking care for them in holding center. And those people, basically the women, even who came with the children, when they were migrated from Nepal, they have no children, but when they came back, they have a children. And those women very much hesitate to directly go to even their home, because there are so many social stigma and so many unmanaged situation herself, but she became much vulnerable because there is a threat of COVID. At the same time, there is no response. So where she go? So this kind of things, I have seen many districts has managed, but nobody recognized this. So my question is for Richard and Hiramani Dai both. In implementation of the federalism in Nepal, whether this kind of district level institution need to be collapsed, or it has to give certain degree of function so that the provincial government take place, or the local government will stand strongly to deliver the service. Otherwise, there is no properly the federalism is functioning. So can anyone respond to this? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I'd like to request our panelists to answer the questions and comments, and we'll take another questions in another round. Thank you.
Richard, you can go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. So on the first question from, I think, Sushan, yeah, on the women entrepreneurs and what is the view from the SDG vantage point. I don't think there's any prescribed strategy for developing these development challenges from the SDG. The SDG set targets on what we should strive towards, but I think the how has to be determined in country with the technical expertise that's in the country, as well as international expertise. And most importantly, the point of today, in dialogue with the entrepreneurs or the beneficiaries at hand. So I think the first question really should come from the person who asked the question. What does she think needs to be done? And I think the answer lies there. And the how has to come from various experts like yourselves. So, my view, in the relief packages were fairly extensive for MSMEs, and particularly on access to finance. But, I believe there were some challenges with the smaller scale, the unregistered enterprises in accessing these relief packages. That's a big challenge. So how to get around that? And I think the longer term issues of SME growth have to do with a range of things that should be addressed. One is the policy environment and reconciling the policies toward SMEs at all aspects across the 3 tiers of government, and simplifying the processes for registration, for licensing, and accessing finance. It could be digitized in some areas, the access to finance, simplified platforms for micro and small enterprises. So some of those policy issues, the institutional, the service aspect, simplifying the services, I think some of the access to market issues, looking along the value chains and seeing why are certain industries struggling to access markets in India or even urban markets, and overcoming those supply chain barriers that for the small scale suppliers. some of those are quality issues that could be reconciled. For example, if you looked at tea, cardamom, some of these industries that supply India, there's a range of policy issues that are actually on the India side of the border, or unfair market advantages for Indian suppliers that hurt Nepali suppliers. So looking at that across the Nepali-India channels. And I do think there are aspects that relate to gender and discrimination, why understanding the challenges that women entrepreneurs face. There are also capacity issues, and there's a range of skill training programs in the country. There's the UNDP MEDEP, supported MEDEP program that's more targeted toward the micro enterprises. That's fairly broadly available, but really the technical support for the small and the medium to help them to grow, address their capacity constraints is still a big gap. So I think overall the Ministry of Industry is calling for a growth strategy, what they call a growth model for SMEs, really a sophisticated strategy of how they can help with graduation from small to medium, medium to large, and addressing the constraints that businesses at various stages face. So those are some of the solutions, but the mix really has to be determined across the tiers of government and in consultation with the entrepreneurs. Now, the question on ILO, that's a big question. We have programs on employment, social security, migration, bonded labor, trafficking, child labor. So I would say some of the big initiatives right now is we have a program supporting the NRNA on supporting migrant workers in the countries of destination with immediate outreach and registration support, assisting the challenges they face before they come back. And we have some relief support coming in so when they do come back. So that's a program we have with the Swiss. So working again with the consulates, but also the NRNA to support the consulates, to fill in the gaps. So in countries like UAE and Kuwait, Malaysia, we're helping with that. Even setting up outreach camps in industrial areas where migrant workers can go and register for support, and linking that support, those needs, to the consulates, and making sure the migrant workers get what they need. Also addressing some of the disputes they have with their employers there. Make sure they get their salaries and any kind of disputes are resolved to the degree possible before they come back. So that's the migration area. On the social security area, I think our big focus is really build back a system that works better. We have the contribution social security system in the country where you have a number of schemes that have been designed, but they haven't been adequately costed. So if you look at say, for example, the proposed pension scheme for workers, it's very expensive in terms of the contribution rate, and it's not really what workers want. So we're advocating to change that structure, reduce the contribution rates, base it on actuarial analysis. So this kind of tweaking of the contribution-based social security system. The unemployment insurance is really critical. We saw in this crisis that it wasn't developed, so now we're pushing with the unemployment insurance scheme. And then again, the whole issue of the wage workers, informal economy, we will in the next 6 months propose some schemes that could be implemented in informal economy, but the critical factor there is to get the government to recognize that informal economy workers and business owners, they need contribution for their social security from the government, so it can't all be from themselves. It's just not going to work that way. So we have to push for that. The social security. Employment side, a range of options. There's the immediate kind of supporting the PMEP and some municipalities really to, it hasn't delivered well. The projects that are, they're selected are not productive projects, and they're not part of the planning process. There's no technical support. So this kind of issue of some places trying to get the PMEP system working better. That's a big challenge. Also labor intensive road infrastructure. We have a rural road maintenance program that we run with the World Bank before, and now we're continuing it in COVID. Really, it gives women jobs on rural road maintenance projects and monitors those projects. So that's a fairly effective way of getting people to work quick. But of course, the longer term work is really employment strategies that are implemented at municipal level. So there's a range of interventions that we carry out there at municipal level. So that's the issue on what ILO is doing. I probably should tell you what the UN is doing, but realizing that the UN has a socio-economic framework that addresses health. So it's all of this support for the health, mainly from WHO coming in to support the government in the COVID context with a range of support issues. Now, of course, we're addressing the health capacity needs. Also the UNICEF and the communication angles of various agencies to support, behavior change communication during the COVID context, and a number of other health programs. There's a combined UN effort on jobs and social protection, but there's also a work area around this issue of consultation and community engagement. So that's it. On gender equality, I agree that Nepal is way advanced in terms of representation, much better than the US, many countries. I think capacity in some cases is an issue, people jumping in positions. But I think the biggest challenge is that, the cultural factors. The fact that many men still think they're the best position to make decisions for women, policymakers. And if you even go into parliament, you see the women that I know, the influential women parliamentary leaders, they do complain that nobody really listens or takes up their ideas. It's still men making those decisions. So that's a struggle, and I think it's going to take a while to change those cultural attitudes. I mean, we can't just put a lot of posters on the wall and say, women rock, women should be listened to, or whatever. It's going to take years of fighting and changing slowly this imbalance and the cultural systems. And of course, when women do have positions of power, when they are business leaders, they have more power also to challenge those patriarchal views. So we need to keep pushing with the efforts that are already very solid on that. And I think that's it. I'm gonna stop and turn over to Hiramani. Thank you. Sorry I talked so much.
Thanks, Richard. You have made my job easier because some of the questions have been answered. So there's still some questions for me. And the most, I think, interesting question is about capacities. How do you build capacity? There are, in this topic, there are three levels for capacity building. Capacity can be built at an individual level. I have some skills. I can transfer these skills to you, and you are as good as me, individual level. Then there is this organizational level, that you have some management skills, arrangement, so the individual skills are not enough. So the organizing skills are needed, and it is difficult to transfer these organizational skills from one organization, one person to another. Individual skills are easy. And then at the third level, the highest level, there are institutional issues. For example, Richard just spoke about values, norms, cultures. At an institutions, you see an interplay of values, cultures, norms, and so on. So at this level, transferring capacity from one institution to another is a challenge. But what we need is actually, we need to see institutions stronger, and then organizations stronger, and individual, we can manage them. So what we need at best, institutions, it is really difficult to transfer capacity to institutional level. And then organizational level is easier, but it's less important than institutional capacity. And the individual capacity, your capacity, my capacity, etc., is even less important, but we can do something about this. So there is this inverse relationship between these capacities and the transferability. And that's a challenge for us, because what we need to see it build capacity at the highest level, and it is difficult. And individuals do matter, are important, but they can't do only this much, because even if they know, even they can do something, but it doesn't happen at the institutional level. So that's the challenge. And you should think of how to strengthen these efforts, building capacity at organizational and institutional level. At an individual level, we do have some capacity, and you might know that Nepal is known for weak institutions with strong individuals. Our government is always described as strong individuals, weak organizations. That's an irony. Normally, you would expect that if strong individuals get together, their organization would also be stronger. That would be the logical consequence of strong individuals. But in our case, there are strong individuals, but the organization they work for are not as strong. And the institution they work for are even less strong. So how do you address this irony? The one question to do this is incentives. How do you mobilize these strong people in favor of reform, in favor of inclusion, etc.? That's the question. And the lack of incentives, lack of rewards, etc., is the question. And unless you do that, you will remain stuck in this difficult area. The second issue was, and Romaji raised this issue very importantly. Thank you, Romaji. Our challenge was, speaking of inclusion, what about our forum today? Our forum itself is non-inclusive. So that this was a challenge, and probably Avinash is taking note of that. But to me, this capacity, and she says the ability to do things, are related actually. Even if the law, as I also said earlier, even if the law allows you to do this, you go to the government office now, to any government office, and they will say that we are open, we are equal for all. So in a formal sense, there is no discrimination on that. But because of the capacity to engage with this agency, then either you will get service or you will be rejected service. So just formal regulations, arrangements, freedom, you said, spoke about freedom, are important. They are important on their own rights, but they will not be enough if you are talking about a society which is culturally, has cultural challenges in terms of recognizing each other's role and diversity and so on. So yes, the freedom should be there for every one of us, but then in order to be able to exercise this freedom, capacity would also be needed, and the capacity doesn't develop in itself. So the society would have to be engaged in developing the society. Which is also a major theme of Amartya Sen when he speaks about freedom. Freedom without capacity is a major challenge. So we do need that. Civil society organization, I said that the space is shrinking, and the space is shrinking, which means the civil society, which is by definition is between the economic society and the political society. So it should be a neutral agency, impartial agency to promote the welfare and interest of those without wealth and without political power. So if you have power, you can go to politics. If you have wealth, you can do economics. If you have neither politics nor power, you are part of the middle, and civil society should represent that. In our case, unfortunately, civil society seems to be divided, to be politically aligned, to be not necessarily representing the interests of this class, of the middle, people in the middle, and therefore it has not been able to earn the reputation of a true civil society. That's the problem, and therefore, and this part, the government has seen that, and therefore the government comes up with a number of rules and regulations saying that you are not as impartial as you should have been. So there are some around issues of civil society organizations themselves. Therefore, there is some, I think there is a need for self-introspection among civil society leaders, representatives, and then they can engage in this debate more effectively. A difficult question was, how can a government become more citizen-friendly? Right? And again here, the modern government, the government of the 21st century, must necessarily be friendly to citizens. And in our policy paper, the government gives the impression that yes, we are all for the citizens, citizen-friendly. But in practice, it is not the case. So what should they do is the question of engage citizens in evaluating what the government is doing for them. In many cases, and also Krishnaji raised this issue, in many issues, In Nepal, I see that there are several agencies within the government, but the government is one house. There are different rooms, but there is one house. And in the room, people change. You are in one room one today, and you are in room today. So if you are given this responsibility of of monitoring the work of your friend in the other room, you would not be effective, because it is an issue of conflict of interest. You are all part of the system. So what you should actually promote is let others mean people who are not in the government, and the citizens, you say that, citizens, let citizens um, make an assessment of what the government people have done. And based on that, the relationships can build, because the citizens will be impartial, they speak for themselves, and they are more neutral, because if you are evaluating your own activities, what would the result? We see that in Nepal, the NPC undertakes every 6 months the famous NDAC meetings, National Development Action Committees, headed by the Prime Minister. And all ministers and secretaries report their progress. Every time, more than 90%. That's it. Whereas at the grassroots level, you see many challenges, but every ministry is making progress at a level of more than 90%. Because you are allowed to evaluate your own activities. So it is to be expected, 100%, 90% achievement. But the actual changes in the lives of the people has not been there. So this lacuna should be addressed by giving the people the opportunity to assess the performance of those who are supposed to be serving them. And only then we can build this as it called, citizen-friendly relations. And finally, last question for me was whether we can promote cooperatives and financial institutions. Of course, cooperatives have in Nepal a long history. They are very close to the people. Even now with the cooperatives, when they start taking funding activities, loan, savings, and credit activities, they are the closest institutions to the people and have on good reputation being close to the people. So this capacity can be used for better outcomes for development and so on. So that's also culturally good, traditionally fit for the purpose, and people trust them. So we can have some ways to make them more effective, which means then their activity will translate into good social and economic outcomes. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard and Hiramani sir, for answering the queries to our audience. So, because of the time limitation, we'll just take one question. So, we have a question from Pratishtha Koirala. So, Pratishtha ji, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question, and then we'll just take these questions, and then we'll go for a wrap-up thing.
Hello, namaste, everyone. So I think Hiramani sir has well explained about how we can empower people into more of participation and empowered participation, rather, let's say. So my question is so it is around similar thing. How do we materialize the representation into empowered participation? Like, we do have the token representation, but real empowered participation has been a challenge for us. So is economic empowerment the only means to exercise the agency, like you said? Because I assume political power should be the supreme thing, where people can actually have the right to change the policy and influence the policy. So should that not be the major means where actual most vulnerable people who are there as representation can change or exercise the agency? So that is my another question. And what are the other ways for inclusive policy, or what other ways for inclusive policy are adopted by countries that have made significant progress in terms of inclusive policy development? So these are a few of my questions. Thank you.
Good. Richard, I will go ahead this time. Very interesting question, Pratishtha. Yes, as you said, and I said earlier also, political power is the most important thing, also for inclusion, because politics can change things. They have the mandate to do things, and they have the resources. to do things. So they should be able to do this. But um, politics, political power, political leaders, etc. We cannot just wish for the good behavior from politicians. The history of the world, so that there is a new book called Narrow Corridor, which says that having examined the history of 100 countries for the 2000 years, they have now established that every leader, democratically elected or whatever, had some dictatorial ambitions. So it is a question of society engaging against that. So we can't rely on politicians just hoping that they would be good for us. So they have their own ambitions, they have their own power ambitions, especially, and it is not necessary that they would work towards better inclusion, because the one of the objectives of a politician is also to maximize power. So we as a society should be able to put a check against that. So it's a two-way process. One is the political power, but also the social power can be exercised against the political ambition to be dictatorial, and then to actually to force them to be more inclusive in their behavior. So it's a two-way process, and in this process, it can be facilitated, as you said in your question. Economic empowerment does allow you to be more effective in this exercise, because this is not everything, but it should open more opportunities. It should allow you to be more active if you have economic power. And then you can leverage this economic power in favor of some political changes also. So it's a two-way process, and you can start anywhere, but just don't wait for any political agency, any political leadership to be more inclusive, to be more favorable, because it's not inherently in their interest. So we should also, I think we should always see politicians with some level of suspicion. We should be suspicious about what they're trying to achieve, and suspicions in a positive sense, of course. And we should help them to be more people friendly, more inclusive, etc. So that's what I would say in response to your question. But Rita, I would like to add more. Or?
No, thank you. I couldn't add to that. Thank you very much, Hiramani.
Thank you. Thank you again, Richard and Hiramani sir, for accepting our invitation and sharing your thoughts briefly. Actually, like this kind of discussion can go for hours and hours, and because of the limited time constraint, we have to wrap up this session. But we, MPPM Scholars Network, would like to assure that we'll not limit this issue to discussion only, and we'll promote, we'll try to publish some kind of like policy communication documents and share with you all, so that like we can continue to discuss on this and act on this. In response to some of the queries raised by some of our participants regarding inclusive panel, so I would like to apologize on behalf of organizers. But if you look at our past dialogue series, we have always like equal representation of panel. But sorry for today. So with this, for the concluding remarks, I would like to request Dr. Kriti Kusum Joshi for sharing, to share his concluding remarks. And Dr. Joshi is an urban specialist at City Planning Commission at Kathmandu Metropolitan City, and he's also president at Fulbright Alumni Association of Nepal. So, Dr. Joshi, please.
Thank you, Venus. Thank you, Dr. Howard and Dr. Ghimire, for sharing your very thoughtful insights on this very important and relevant topic, if somewhat vague topic as well. Yes, we are now in a very confusing stage or state of development with our obsession with economic growth and big projects. I would like to thank Dr. Howard for raising the issue of coconut. I have some relatives there, and I am following that issue as well. One lesson we seem to have never learned is that as important as economic growth if not important, is the distribution effects of development, particularly when we are talking about inclusion and social sustainable development. Talking about sustainable development, as Dr. Howard said, we can have different opinions, we can have different definitions. For me, like sustainable development is, it's not enough to sustain the existing level of resources because we are already in deficit. So we need to generate additional resources. And in the context of Nepal, it's high time that we link sustainable development with regional planning, particularly now that the country has adopted federal structure. Despite the introduction of regional planning in Nepal in 1970s, the failures is evident, among others, in the scale of migration of people from not only from the rural areas to urban areas, but also to foreign lands and even for small earnings. Ironically, we have migrant workers from India and now also from China working in Nepal, who see opportunities here that we Nepalese ourselves don't see. I take it as a lack of communication and trust between people and the government. But with the federal structure and now with the 3 tiers of government in Nepal, I hope that people will be more connected with the government and vice versa. In the past, regional planning failed in Nepal, partly also because the development regions were not administrative regions accountable to people. Now we have provinces and local governments that are powerful administrative regions. So part of the reasons, so it will be more beneficial if we start seeing them as development regions as well. Summing up, we now need to understand Nepal in terms of provinces and local governments, investing there, building capacity, like Dr. Gemiro said, building their capacity and trusting them, working with the governments at the province level and local level. And we can no longer understand Nepal from the lens of Kathmandu, certainly not from the lens of Singadarbar. With this remark, I once again congratulate and thank today's panelists for your excellent presentations. I would also like to thank all the participants for your time and your engagement in the productive discussions. Thank you very much. And with this, I think we are now in a position to close this meeting. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much to you all. Hiramani sir.
Okay, have a good day and stay safe.
Okay.
Thank you very much and
thank you. Namaste to you all. Okay. राम्रो भयो discussion.